models. In this video, we will discuss internal evaluation models. By far, the most common approach to evaluating sovereign country risk among the large financial institutions has been to develop sovereign country risk scoring models based on the key economic ratios for each country, similar to the domestic credit risk scoring model that we discussed in chapter 10. You possibly remember the discriminant model, the Altman-Jet score model we discussed. So the internal country risk evaluation model use the scoring model similar to that. The first step in the country risk analysis is to pick up a set of variables that may be important in explaining your rescheduling probabilities. In many cases, analysts select even more than 40 variables. Here, we will be discussing a few most commonly used variables in country risk evaluation model. First of all is the debt service ratio. You can see that debt service ratio is the ratio of a country's interest and amortization obligation to the value of its exports. You understand that a country's exports are its primary way of generating dollars and other hard currencies. The larger the debt repayments in hard currencies are in relation to export revenues, the greater the probability that the country will have to reschedule its debt. Thus, there should be a positive relationship between the size of debt service ratio and the probability of debt rescheduling. It means that higher the debt ratio, a country will have a higher probability of debt rescheduling. The second one we discuss is the import ratio. Import ratio is the ratio of countries' imports to the total foreign currency reserves. Okay. Many countries must import manufactured goods because inadequate infrastructure limits their domestic production. In times of famine, even food becomes a vital import. To pay for imports, the country must run down its stock of hard currency, its foreign exchange reserves. Thus, the greater its need for imports, especially vital imports, the more quickly a country can be expected to deplete its foreign exchange reserves. Since the first use of reserves to buy vital imports, the larger the ratio of imports to foreign exchange reserves, higher the probability that country will have to reschedule its debt repayment. This is so because these countries generally view repaying foreign debt as being less important than importing foods and supplying vital goods to the domestic production. Thus, the import ratio and the probability of rescheduling should be positively related. The next one is investment ratio. So investment ratio is the ratio of a country's real investment to its GDP. The investment ratio measures the degree to which a country is allocating resources to real investment in factories, machines, and so on, rather than to consumption. Higher this ratio, the more productive the economy should be in the future, and lower the probability that the country would need to reschedule its debt. It means that there is likely to be an inverse relationship between the investment ratio and the probability of rescheduling. So higher investment ratio means the country is less likely to reschedule its debt. The next variable we discuss is the variance of export revenue. And you can say that variance of export revenue is actually the variance of the exports revenue over a period of time. So countries' export revenue may be highly variable due to two risk factors. One is the quantity risk, means that production of the raw commodities the country sells abroad, for example, coffee or sugar, is subject to periodic gluts and shortages. Price risk, on the other hand, means that international dollar prices at which the country can sell its exportable commodities are subject to high volatility as well demand for and supply of a commodity varies. The more volatile a country's export earning, the less certain creditors can be that any time in the future it will be able to meet its repayment commitments. That is, there should be a positive relationship between the variance of export revenue and probability of rescheduling. So higher variance in export revenue may lead to a higher chance that a country will reschedule its debt. The last variable that we discuss is the domestic money supply growth. The domestic money supply growth is actually a change in the money supply. So faster the domestic growth rate of country's money supply, the higher the domestic inflation rate, and the weaker the country's currency becomes in domestic and international markets. When a country's currency loses credibility as a medium of exchange, real output is often adversely impacted, and the country must increasingly rely on hard currencies. The inflation, output, and the payment effects suggest a positive relationship between domestic money supply growth and the probability of rescheduling. So the higher money supply growth is likely to increase the probability of debt rescheduling by a country. Now we can summarize the expected relationship among these the 5 key variables and the probability of rescheduling. So in the left-hand side, we have probability of rescheduling, which is a function of the 5 ratios that we discussed so far, the debt service ratios, the import ratio, investment ratio, variance of export earning, and the money supply growth. And these are the expected sign. You can see the positive, positive, positive or negative, positive, and positive. So after selecting the key variables, the financial institution manager normally places countries into 2 groups. For example, bad, who are likely to reschedule, and good, who are non-reschedulers. Then the manager uses a statistical methodology such as a discriminant analysis we discussed in chapter 10 to identify which of these variables best discriminates between the population of rescheduling borrowers and that of non-rescheduling borrowers. Once the key variables and their relative importance or weights have been identified, you can remember we learned it earlier that as we run a regression or a discriminant analysis, we get the coefficients that actually indicates the weights. So once these weights have been identified, the discriminant function can classify as good or bad current sovereign loans or sovereign loan applicants using currently observed values of these ratios. So if I summarize that, we run a model, for example, discriminant or regression model, we get the coefficient of these variables. Then once we have an applicant of this foreign loan, we get the variables for this applicant and multiply this coefficient, and last of all get a value which will indicate that whether the applicant is likely to be a loan rescheduler or non-rescheduler. So that's the end of our discussion about the internal country risk evaluation model. In the next video, we will discuss some key problems associated with the country risk evaluation models. Thank you very much.